In October 1957, a fire started inside a nuclear reactor on the coast of Cumbria. There was no mushroom cloud, no instant national warning, no images of people running through the streets. Just a problem the public could not see. A reactor built to feed Britain's atomic weapons programme had begun to burn. Radioactive material was already escaping into the air. And while families carried on with ordinary life outside the wire, officials inside the system were trying to answer a much uglier question. How bad is this? Because Windscale was not just another industrial site. It was part of Britain's bid to stay a serious power in the Cold War. And when something dangerous happens inside a project like that, the truth does not always move in a straight line. Milk would be pulled from farms, reports would be softened, an official inquiry would be held, but its full report would not be made public until 1988. And decades later, the arguments would still be going. So tonight, the question is not whether Windscale happened. It did. The question is how close Britain came to something worse, what the government knew, and whether this was really a cover-up or something quieter and more recognisable. A dangerous truth carefully managed. I'm Tam, this is Midnight Case Files. The Windscale fire has a strange reputation now. To some people, it is Britain's hidden Chernobyl. To others, it's a Cold War embarrassment that has been exaggerated into legend. Both versions miss what makes this case disturbing. Because Windscale matters not only because a reactor caught fire, it matters because of what followed. The decisions, the tone, the instinct to reassure before explaining. The gap between what was being done in private and what was being said in public. And to understand that, you have to start with the Britain that built it. The Britain of the 1950s was still living in the long shadow of war. The country was exhausted, financially stretched, and painfully aware that global power was being rewritten in nuclear terms. America had the bomb, the Soviet Union had the bomb, Britain wanted its place at the table, and not as a guest. That pressure shaped Windscale from the beginning. The site was built to produce plutonium for Britain's atomic weapons, not for some gentle public vision of scientific progress, not for the smiling, polished version of nuclear power that would later be sold to the public. Windscale began as part of the weapons state. And like many systems built under pressure, it carried risks that were not fully understood. Its graphite-moderated air-cooled piles were powerful, experimental, and in some ways temperamental. One known problem was the build-up of what became known as Wigner energy inside the graphite core. To release it, operators carried out a heating process known as annealing. In theory, this was maintenance. In practice, it meant deliberately heating a reactor whose internal behaviour could be difficult to read with the instrumentation of the time. That is the machinery. Now comes the moment it starts to fail. On 10th of October 1957, after problems during annealing operations, Windscale Pile No. 1 caught fire. The signals had been confusing. Readings did not line up neatly. Operators were trying to interpret partial data from deep inside a reactor core. Then, the picture sharpened in the worst possible way. Fuel had ruptured, temperatures had climbed, and inside the pile, parts of the core were burning. This is the point where this stops being a technical anomaly and becomes a national emergency. The response was not elegant. It was improvised, tense, and dangerous. At one stage, air was still being driven through the pile, which only risked feeding the fire. Eventually, with options collapsing, workers flooded the core with water. Against the odds, it worked. The fire was extinguished on the 11th of October. That clean sentence had a filthy reality. Windscale was not a near miss in the sense of a brief scare. It was the only UK nuclear event retrospectively ranked as an INES Level 5 accident. A fire in a reactor core with wider radiological consequences. And this is where the case starts to split in two. There is the event itself, then there is the story told about it. A reactor fire is one thing, what escapes from it is another. During the fire, radioactive material was released into the atmosphere. One of the main immediate concerns was iodine-131, because it can move quickly into grass, into cows, into milk, and then into people, especially children. That matters because milk turns a distant industrial accident into something intimate. Breakfast, tea, a child at a kitchen table. And behind the scenes, the authorities reacted like people who understood exactly how serious that pathway could be. Milk from land around the site was banned from 12th of October, with the restricted area widened on 15th of October. Official records later described milk from roughly 500 square kilometres of nearby countryside being diluted or destroyed for about a month. This is not what a state does when nothing serious has happened. But the public message remained restrained, careful, controlled. This is a crucial thing about Windscale. The public was not told absolutely nothing. This was not silence in the purest sense. It was something more polished than that. A managed version. Enough acknowledgement to steady nerves. Not enough candour to let the public fully see the scale of failure inside the system. And that distinction matters because it gets to the heart of what kind of cover-up this was. An official inquiry was launched quickly under Sir William Penny. It reported in late October 1957 and its conclusion fed into the government white paper the following month. But the Penny report itself was not made public in full until January 1988. That detail sits at the centre of Windscale's reputation, not because it proves some single giant memo saying, "bury this." It does not. What it shows is something more familiar. A culture of secrecy, political sensitivity, an official instinct to release the version of events that best preserves confidence in the programme. And in fairness, some of the people involved were not villains in a melodrama. Some were trying to contain a crisis. Some were trying to understand it. Some probably believed that limiting alarm was part of their job. But whatever the motive, the effect was the same. The public version was cleaner than the real one. The state dealt privately with a messier picture than the one most people were allowed to see. Not total silence, not total honesty, something in between. Controlled truth. And once you see Windscale that way, a lot of the later arguments make more sense. This is the hardest part of the story, because it is where people often want either total reassurance or total horror. Real radiation accidents rarely give you either. There was no obvious mass casualty seen outside the plant, no instant public death toll, no abandoned British ghost town. But that does not mean the fire was harmless. Later estimates of long-term health impacts suggested the accident may have caused on the order of around 100 fatal cancers, with other estimates running higher. Though newer epidemiological work has also found no detectable increase in thyroid cancer incidence among some of the cohorts thought most exposed as children. That is not a neat ending. It is exactly the opposite. It means the most honest answer is uncertainty inside boundaries. Was there likely long-term harm? Yes. Can every cancer case be laid at the feet of Windscale with courtroom certainty? No. And that uncertainty became part of the political comfort of the story. Because if damage unfolds statistically, slowly, and imperfectly, it is much easier for institutions to lean on phrases like no immediate danger and no cause for alarm. That is why the health questions still feel morally unfinished. Not because the numbers are simple, not because the burden of investigation, openness and long-term accountability never matched the seriousness of the event itself. This is the point where the internet usually reaches for a flamethrower. Britain's hidden Chernobyl is a brilliant phrase. It is also misleading. Chernobyl involved an explosion, catastrophic reactor destruction, immediate deaths among workers and responders, mass evacuations, and contamination on a scale that made it a defining global disaster. Windscale was serious. Windscale was dangerous. Windscale released contamination across much of England and into parts of Northern Europe. But it was not that. And saying that does not let anyone off the hook. In fact, the real lesson is arguably sharper. Windscale shows how a democratic state can handle a grave technological failure without telling one gigantic cinematic lie. It can do it through tone, through delay, through selective publication, through reassurance that arrives faster than clarity. That is less apocalyptic than Chernobyl. It is also, in a way, more recognisable. Because this is what institutional self-protection often looks like in the real world. Not a blackout, a dimmer switch. Part of what keeps Windscale alive is the way it was remembered. The event was real, the secrecy was real, the later arguments over health were real, so a vacuum opens up between official understatement and public suspicion. And vacuums like that fill fast. One side shrugs and said it was handled. The other side inflates it into a buried national apocalypse. Neither version really respects the shape of the truth. The truth is narrower than the legend, but heavier. A reactor built for weapons production caught fire. Contamination escaped. Milk had to be pulled from the food chain at scale. An inquiry was held, but its full report stayed out of public view for decades. Long-term health effects were likely enough to warrant serious concern, but difficult enough to quantify that institutions could live inside that ambiguity for years. That is not a myth, that is a case file. So did Britain secretly cover up its worst nuclear disaster? Not in the cartoon version, not as a total silence, not as a hidden British Chernobyl airbrushed out of history. But yes, there was suppression. Yes, there was minimisation. Yes, there was a clear gap between what officials were doing privately and what the public was being allowed to understand clearly at the time. Windscale was the UK's most serious nuclear accident. It exposed technical weakness, poor understanding inside a weapons-driven system, and an official culture that treated openness as a hazard of its own. And perhaps the bleakest thing about the whole story is this. Once the reactor burned, the truth was handled almost like the fallout. Measured, managed, diluted, released only in amounts the public was thought able to tolerate. That is what makes Windscale a midnight case file. If you made it this far, you're exactly who this channel is for. Not people chasing the loudest version of a story. People chasing the truest one. For more Cold War case files, hidden state failures, and the darker corners of history that never sit comfortably inside the official version, subscribe and stay with me. And if there is another file you want opened, drop it in the comments. I'm Tam, this is Midnight Case Files, and I'll see you in the next one.